Hello there. In the 1980s, journalists, and in particular photojournalists, were seen as the epitome of cool. Now it may be 18-year-old TikTok influencers, but then the unwashed war correspondents were the real thing. There was a spate of movies in that decade in which the heroes were all journalists. Salvador, Under Fire, The Killing Fields, and The Year of Living Dangerously were probably the big ones. And it was during this time that I was entering the world of photography. And these movies had a big impact on me, and I think the most appealing thing probably was the hyperreality that this life offered. An escape from the mundaneness of life is possible when you're immersed in something so vivid. You're able to escape the ordinariness and the monotony of daily life. What Milan Kundera called the unbearable lightness of being. You don't have to worry about things like feeding the dog, paying the electricity bill, or even what you're going to have for supper that night. Like a drug addict, you are escaping reality for an adrenaline rush. And like any other attempt to escape reality, you have to come down on the other side of the trip. This particular downer is that life, ordinary life, is even more difficult to deal with because in comparison it's even more bland. In this video I look mainly at Oliver Stone's film Salvador, which for me at the time showed probably the most exciting career path that I could find.
The confrontation started when students, workers, and peasants linked to the guerrillas occupied foreign embassies and took over the National Cathedral.
Director Oliver Stone had a very hard time getting funding for this film. He was forced to put a second mortgage on his house to get finance. In the end, the film was made on a budget of just under $5 million. Writer and photographer Richard Boyle co-wrote the script with Stone, and the film is based on his experiences in Salvador. Boyle is a bit of a reprobate, and so the film uses sex and drugs and alcohol to hook the viewer into the story. Then later Stone kind of hits you with the serious stuff. It has a gonzo journalism feel. That's a style of reporting that places the reporter at the center of the story. Think Hunter S. Thompson. El Salvador had descended into brutal civil war during the 80s, and the Cold War was still very much alive, and the US was supporting the right-wing military administration. They were fighting a communist-leading guerrilla group. The regime carried out horrific programs of repression and torture and massacres, and more than 30,000 people were, as I said, disappeared and were still unaccounted for at the end of the war. Oliver Stone thought that El Salvador had the potential to turn into a rerun of the Vietnam War. This is a clip from real television footage showing journalists covering the violence in El Salvador and being caught in crossfire.
¡Salgan! ¡Rápido!
The film centers around a Richard Boyle character played by James Woods. He comes across as a real weasel.
I kind of weaseled around a lot in my life, you know what I mean? I'm trying to get the edge all the time, but basically I would say that I'm a good-hearted person.
What is good or decent about you? What redemption can you expect?
Well, none, I guess, but look, okay, you got a point, okay? I am a fucking weasel. There's no doubt about it, but think about this.
The real photographer in this film is a character called Cassidy, played by John Savage. He's very loosely based on a Newsweek photographer called John Hoagland, who was killed while covering the violence in El Salvador. You seldom see Boyle taking pictures, and when you do, he's completely untogether. In these two scenes, he's borrowing a lens and then bumming film from a kind of very together Cassidy.
John, have you got a 24 or 28, I can use? John, can you lay 2 more rolls of Tri-X on me?
John Hoagland was a very experienced photojournalist, and apart from working in El Salvador, he covered Nicaragua as well as Beirut. Here are a couple of his images. Throughout the film, Cassidy is searching for that great picture, and he gets it moments before his death. In real life, John Hoagland shot off these frames as he was shot and dying. They're a lot less dramatic than the movie scene version, but I think what's so startling about these actual frames is how banal the circumstances were of his actual death. This is the trade-off that war photographers make. It's the adrenaline rush, but on the other side, during every moment in these situations, there's the possibility that things can turn, and you can land up being shot, or, that it's your most unlucky day. Hoagland had entered a restricted area that was known for ambushes, and during a firefight he was hit by an M60 round, probably supplied by the US to the government forces. When I rewatched the film recently, I could feel that it was made 40 years ago, but it still stands up as a very strong movie. In this scene, the dialogue for a photographer is probably a bit, nowadays might seem a bit cliched. But when I first saw it in the 80s, it was really powerful stuff.
You know what made photographers like Robert Capa great, Rich? They weren't after the money. They captured the nobility of human suffering.
You're right up there with him, John. You're in his league. You're the best.
You gotta get close, Rich, to get the truth. You get too close, you die. Someday, I want a shot like Capa. Someday.
John Savage obviously did some research for the role because his portrayal of a photojournalist in the field is very accurate and realistic. The way he's constantly on edge and alert, and the way he handles the camera is kind of how it's done. James Woods, the actor, is very fastidious about cleanliness, while Richard Boyle was quite happy to wear the same smelly clothes every day on set, and he was known for missing the odd shower or two. So Woods didn't have very much time for Boyle, and during shooting he didn't want Boyle anywhere near him, but he was forced to have him right next to him in all the shoots. Boyle would also have this bad habit of critiquing Woods' performance, which didn't go down well. At the Academy Awards, Woods was nominated for Best Actor. Boyle eventually became a Californian professor in film, and then later moved to the Philippines, where he hooked up with a local woman and adopted a couple of kids. He died there in 2016, aged 74. Apart from the great script, I think having Boyle on the set made a big difference. Oliver Stone obviously drew on his knowledge of how real photojournalists operate, because all the photography scenes have an authentic ring to them, as opposed to many other war photographer movies. This clip shows Nick Nolte in another 1980s film called Under Fire. Maybe non-photographers wouldn't notice, but he's shooting on what looks like a 50mm lens, and the shots they show throughout the action sequence would have required a 200mm lens or longer. There's also a scene in which Nick Nolte's character agrees to take a picture of a dead rebel leader. They do this in order to make him appear alive, and then this picture influences the outcome of the conflict. Now, while this is an obvious violation of journalistic ethics, and it would be difficult to come back from doing this kind of thing. At the end of the film, there's an exchange between the Nick Nolte character and his girlfriend. And I think it says a lot about why one is drawn to do this type of work. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.